Now.
Okay. I was going to show you, because since you were showing books or whatever, this is the nonsense that I'm reading now, which is textual criticism in the Hebrew Bible. And let me tell you, this will help you fall asleep at night.
Isn't that a
If you're
page?
not interested in it.
A real page turner.
It is. I think it's super fascinating, but I'm very boring.
I read a book once called Chronology of the Old Testament, something like that. I remember it's a fairly big book, and it was an incredible sleep aid. I mean, just absolutely, you couldn't read hardly a page without dozing off.
It's one of those books that once you put it down, you can't pick it back up again.
That's hilarious. I love that.
Okay, so hi everybody. I'm Dustin, and you could just call me Dustin or hey you or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I'm not real big on titles and everything. And so tonight I'm going to be teaching on the Book of Acts. Not so much on the content of the Book of Acts, but I'm going to teach us how we're supposed to read the Book of Acts. Okay, and you know how like the Book of Hebrews says that some people are drinking milk and they need to be drinking, or they need to be eating solid food. I'm not ashamed to say this is a solid food teaching, so I don't apologize about that. So buckle your seatbelts. You're in for I don't know. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. So please feel free to ask questions. Likely the question that you ask is the question that everyone else wants to ask, but they're too afraid to do it. And so you can ask it and everyone will praise you for not making them look silly. I want to answer any questions that you might have, but I am coming out up front and I'm saying this is probably a little more complicated than a lot of people are used to, but that's okay. That's every once in a while, it's nice to have something big to chew on. Okay, so let's share screen. How about that? Desktop. Okay. Now I want to make this to where it's not in the way. How do I do that? I'm just going to hide it all or show small. How about that? Okay. Can everybody see this PowerPoint right here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. So this is on how should we read the Book of Acts. I put it's a critical introduction because it's not a middle school, Sunday school introduction. And the reason why I think we need to do this is that there's a question of genre, and the word genre is G-E-N-R-E, that comes into the Bible. And, you know, when it comes to genre is just basically a fancy word meaning a type of literature. Okay. When we have the newspaper, I want you to think of your newspaper. Okay. You have the front page, and generally the front page is just going to tell you just the facts. That's just the way it is. Okay. And when you read the the front page, that's what you expect. You have a certain expectation when you come to that type of literature. Now, when you flip over to the comics and you've got, you know, 3 little squares of a comic of Garfield, by the time you get to the 3rd square, you're expecting it to be funny and comical. Okay? There's an expectation when you come to that type of literature that it's supposed to be funny and amusing. You get that. If you read it and it's not funny, you sit there and you say, this is supposed to be funny. Okay? Now, you don't expect the front page to be funny, unless it's about Trump or something. We're not going to get into that. But also, you could turn over to like the wanted ads, or even just the ads for you know, things that people are selling, or ads for jobs and stuff like that. You go to that with a certain expectation that they're going to be small, they're going to have phone numbers, they're going to have contact information, they're going to have a certain job and a certain description. It's a very different type of literature than the front page of the comics. And then you can go to the editorials, and you know, during political season, you can hear talking elephants and talking donkeys. Okay, but you understand that elephants don't talk and donkeys don't talk. You just understand that with the editorials, it's just usually some sort of comic that is satire to describe something that's going on in politics. Okay, So even in a basic newspaper, we have multiple types of literature that are in there, and we all understand that. We get that, okay? For some reason, a lot of people have been taught that when it comes to the Bible, that you just read it all the same way. Maybe you were taught that, well, you just read everything in the Bible literally, unless it doesn't make sense, and then you read it figuratively. That is too naive a way of reading the Bible, and unfortunately, we're not going to excuse ourselves from doing that anymore. There are different types of literature in the Bible. There's historical sections. There's prophecy. There's poetry. There are gospel accounts, which are ancient biographies. The Book of Acts is its own piece of literature. You have epistles. You have the Book of Hebrews, which is technically not an epistle. It's probably more of a sermon. You have 1 John, which everyone keeps calling a letter, but it's really not a letter. It's more of a theological tractate. And then you have the Book of Revelation, which is an apocalypse, very similar to Daniel. So you have a variety of types of literature, even in the Bible. And unless somebody tells you how to read these things, we're going to misunderstand them. In the same way that if you read the front page of the newspaper, like you read the comic section, you're going to misunderstand it. If you read the editorial section the way that you read the help wanted section, you're going to misunderstand it. So that's the point of this. I'm trying to help us read the book of Acts. Okay. Since I have to share screen, I can't look at people's body language, and I can't even tell if anyone's fallen asleep yet, or if they've left, or if they're shaking their heads or anything. So give me some sort of feedback here.
You're doing great. Love it.
Doing okay. All right.
I have not fallen to sleep yet.
Okay. All right. So I saw you got your pillow, so we're getting ready.
You better not bail there, Dustin, on me, because you have my full attention. 2 words you said that already is going to correct some misunderstanding that I've had for all my life about the Bible. So speak on, sir.
Okay. Well, I will preface this and say that, you know what? I would say probably 80% of what I tell you is correct, and 20% of it is probably misunderstood. I unfortunately don't know which of the 20% that is. I'm asking you to read with a critical mindset, read with an open mind, ask questions, and maybe I misspeak and say something I didn't mean to. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe my understanding is mistaken. We could talk about that afterwards, and you guys can straighten me out, because I'm just some young whippersnapper who knows a little bit of the Bible. Okay, so unfortunately my title's there. Okay, all right, so the genre question, which is basically what kind of literature is Acts, okay? So I'm going to do a lot of reading here so you can kind of read along with it. Move my screen. Okay, so Acts appears to be the second of 2 volumes, Luke Acts. Maybe you didn't know this. Maybe you didn't know that Acts was written by Luke. Luke was the author of what we have, the 3rd gospel in our New Testament. So the same person, actually, Luke Acts, wrote more of the New Testament than any other writer that we have. So here's a question. I'm trying to figure out what is the genre. What kind of literature is Acts? If the Gospel of Luke is a Greco-Roman biography, which is a biography is basically a life of somebody. It's the writing of someone's life. That's what biography means. But it's not a modern biography. Modern biographies are very different. Old Greco-Roman biographies was a type of literature that was used back in the 1st century. The Gospels were not brand new literature. They actually took a piece of literature that was already being used, which is just lives of famous people. So if Luke is a Greco-Roman biography with Christian features, then this hints at the historical tendency for Acts as well. Okay, mainly if Luke is writing a history of someone's life in the Gospel of Luke, and if Luke is the first of 2 volumes, Luke Acts, then Acts is probably also likely historical. Okay, putting my cards on the table, Acts seems to fit the genre of ancient historiography, which is basically just an ancient way of telling history. Although Luke nowhere hides the fact that he brings his Christian bias to the table when he writes. And I'm also noting that ancient history writers would likewise possess theological presuppositions discernible in their writings. What that basically means is that a lot of people think that if you're just getting history, you're just getting the facts. Well, that's true, but all history is selective. If I were to ask you what happened on Good Friday, most of you are going to say, Jesus died, and I was going to say, the number of people that were died next to him, but then I realized that's still an open question in this group. So we'll leave that aside. But if I were to say, hey, what happened on Good Friday? We tend to think, oh, Jesus died. Okay. Well, we were very selective in what we said there, because we basically said, well, what happened, right outside Jerusalem to a particular person. But things happen in every person's life on that day. Okay, so if you're writing a history of something, you are selective by nature. You're going to focus on a group of people. You're going to focus on a nation. You're going to focus on something. So that's just kind of how history works. Okay, so he has a Christian bias, but the point is everybody has a bias. There's another guy named Polybius, and he is a 2nd century BCE Roman historian. BCE is what some people just call BC. And he wrote in his book, which is called Histories, this is what he wrote. He wrote, "It is only indeed by study of the interconnection of all the particular, the resemblances and differences, that we are enabled to at least make a general survey and thus derive both benefit and pleasure from history." So this guy who's writing a book on histories, okay, he's a Roman historian, with his writings that are lasting and overlapping into the time of Luke. He's saying that we study everything, and you know what? When you read history, you can get benefit and you can get pleasure from history. History can be fun. It can be exciting. There could be drama in history. And anyone who's read Acts chapter 27, where you have the shipwreck and everything that's involved with that, and the fact they're going to throw people over, and then everything, like it's an entire drama. And it's okay. History can actually be fun. I remember teaching the book of Acts. I've actually taught this course to college undergrads that are preparing for ministry. And I asked the question, how many of you actually think that history in school was fun? And they almost all raised their hands. And I said, man, you guys are sick. Something's wrong with you. Like, history's not supposed to be fun. But the point is, like, this guy's saying, hey, when you write history, it could be fun. And so we could see that with Luke. We can see that with Luke's writing. Okay. Lucian, who's a 2nd century CE orator, which CE is another way of saying AD. So the century after Luke wrote the book of Acts. He says this in his book. His book is called How to Write History. That's a pretty good book, How to Write History. So that's what he says. He says, how one could write history better. There are some who omit or deal curiously with major and memorable events, and lacking professionalism, they spend ages on detailed and laborious descriptions of the most trivial things. Okay, so this guy, whose name actually is very similar to Luke, his name is Lucian. He says, if you're writing history, if you're a history writer like Luke is, he says you would be doing it wrong if you spent all of your details on the smallest, detailed, most laborious descriptions, on the most trivial things. Okay, so if Luke is writing history in the same way of the conventions that we saw in the previous two writers, would we expect him to give us all of the details on every single possible event? And the answer is no, we shouldn't. Okay, if Luke is writing history in the same way that other people are, he's not going to focus on detailed and laborious descriptions of the most trivial things. Okay, if he's being professional. Okay, all right. Lucian also suggests that when a historian describes a speech, so we're talking about speeches here. Okay, he says, quote, "It is most important that his language suits his character and his subject, and these also should be made as clear as possible. However, on these occasions, you are allowed to act as the orator and display your oratorical powers." And so he writes that again in his book on how to write history. Now, by the way, speeches, they actually make up 1/3 of the book of Acts. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but 1/3 of the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is 28 chapters. Okay, so 1/3 of 28 is about 9 chapters and a little bit more. So 9 chapters is just speeches. Okay, and so Lucian is saying, as a history writer for Luke, hey, if you're going to write speeches, you got to make sure the language suits the character of the person. Okay, so in Acts chapter 1, Jesus is going to give a speech. In Acts chapter 2, Peter's going to give a speech. In Acts chapter 13 and 26, Paul's going to give a speech. Okay, now let me tell you this: like, if someone's going to give up and give a speech or give a sermon, like in a church, okay, you expect it to be 30 or 40 minutes. That's a good, decent speech or a good, decent sermon. Now, you can read all of the speeches in the book of Acts individually. You can read them out loud, and they'll take you 2 minutes max. Okay? Do you think when they gave these sermons that they were only 2 minutes long? And the answer is no. The point is that these are probably abbreviations of what was actually said, okay? Because if you have to remember, they didn't have tape recorders back then, okay? So the speeches were remembered, they were passed on, and eventually Luke wrote them down, but we're seeing here they're likely to be abbreviations that fit the language and the character of the subject.
Cliff notes,
okay?
whatever that means.
I'm sorry?
I just wrote Cliff Notes, basically.
Okay. I'm not able to read that when it comes up, so that's okay.
Yeah, they're basically Cliff Notes instead of full-blown.
Yeah, that's okay. They're abbreviations. That's fine. Well, the thing is, if you don't know that, you're going to read all of these sermons and you're going to think, wow, these sermons were really short. Okay. My secretary here is telling me to slow down, so I will do that. Okay. All right. Luke's selectivity and freedom can be observed in that Paul's conversion is described in 3 places in the book of Acts, each with slightly different wordings. Okay, so here's what I'm going to show you. I mean, I'm making the case that Luke, as a historian, had the freedom to be selective and to organize this material. And you can see this because the description of Paul's conversion appears in the book of Acts 3 different times. But when you look at all 3 of them, they're slightly different in the details, but yet the same author wrote them. So if the same author wrote a description of Paul's conversion 3 times in 3 slightly different ways, that means that he himself is comfortable writing with that flexibility. And if he is comfortable writing with that flexibility, then we should too. Okay? So what I did was I put them on this page so you could sit there and look at it. So this is Paul's conversion. I hate calling it a conversion because I think it's more of a calling. That's more of a longer subject. So his conversion shows up here in Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 22, and Acts chapter 26. Okay? And I just quoted out of the NASB. But you can sit there and you can look and you can see that the same description has a lot of things that are similar, okay? And I put in bold the things that are similar, okay? A light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Oh, my goodness, I clicked the wrong button. Sorry. All right. And he said, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Get up, okay? Those words right there are the same in all 3 accounts, okay? But there are other little details that are different. And they're just there. I mean, you could read this in your Bible. You could figure that out for yourself. Some of the details are different. But the point is, the gist of the story, what really matters, and really the part that if you were taking and you were retelling the story to anybody, is that part about, hey, the light fell, or the light shined, he fell to the ground, he heard the voice, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He answers, Jesus says who he is, the one who he's persecuting, and he tells him to get up. Okay, but you can just sit there and read. You can look in any translation, and you can see that the story is slightly different in each of them, okay? Now, I'm not sitting here to point this out to say, oh, there's a big contradiction in the Bible. I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to show is that Luke, when he's writing a speech here, a story, he's able to summarize it and to organize it in a way that suits his own setting, and he can have flexibility even within his own book, okay? We're not talking about differences between Matthew and Luke or different books. This is all in the same book. Same story is told in 3 slightly different ways, but the main part of the story, the skeleton is all the same. It's just the meat is slightly different, okay? And what this means, again, is that Luke had that flexibility to write it in these different ways. I think that's the best way of explaining that. So, I mean, otherwise you got to come up with another explanation for all this. I think the best way is to say Luke is writing ancient historiography, and it was an established genre of history in that time to where the writer could organize this material in a way that he thought was good for the document. I think that's the best way of going about that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. If you want to bring up a question about it, you're welcome to do so. I'm probably not going to read all this right here. This is talking about apocryphal acts. What apocryphal acts are basically, there are other books that were written after the book of Acts, like number 1, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Number 2, the Acts of Andrew. Number 3, the Acts of John and the Acts of Peter. Let me tell you this. Paul did not write the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Andrew did not write the Acts of Andrew. John did not write the Acts of John, and Peter did not write the Acts of Peter. Okay, these were all written hundreds of years after these people died. Okay, they're way too late to have any real historical value, and they're full of legendary material. Okay, but they were called these titles: Acts of Paul and Thecla, Acts of Andrew, Acts of John, Acts of Peter. What I do want to point out is the last little bullet point, which is that these works show influence from the book of Acts, but they possess more fictional aspects, which were trendy in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. Since the title, Acts of the Apostle, did not appear on the document that we actually call Acts until the end of the 2nd century, it is likely that it was given to argue for its supremacy against these sort of apocryphal Acts. What that basically means is that when Luke wrote the book of Acts, there's no title on it. It's just the 2nd volume, okay? It had no title, okay? There's no, I mean, I'll say this, if Luke didn't give it a title, then someone gave it a title, okay? That title first appears at the end of the 2nd century. It wasn't something that Luke gave to it, someone gave it. Why did they call it the Acts of the Apostles? Well, it's because there are these other documents of Acts that have kind of legendary, stretched truth documents, and the Christians wanted to say, well, we have the real Acts of the Apostles, okay? So that title, Acts of the Apostles, was not something that Luke wrote down, okay? It's something that was added to it probably 100 years after it was written. It's just kind of an interesting point for us. We're gonna come back and actually ask the question, is the title Acts of the Apostles really the most appropriate description of the book? So again, I don't want to read all of that. Okay, Acts use of the Old Testament, that should be Old Testament, and the genre question. The Acts cites the Hebrew Bible. It's another way of talking about the Old Testament 35 times. That's quite a lot. That's at least once per chapter. The successive reports of the church's progress resembles the narrative pattern exhibited in the history depicted in what a lot of people call the Deuteronomistic history, which is basically the historical section that goes from Deuteronomy all the way to 2 Kings. If you read Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, it's all one unending narrative that ends with the destruction of the temple. Okay, so it's basically when Luke writes the book of Acts, he gives history just like the Old Testament does, writes history. Okay, the Hebrew Bible's historical works use major speeches or editorial comments to introduce themes, sum up themes, and transition to the next unit. Acts utilizes its speeches and its prayers in the very same manner. Okay, so point is, Luke in the book of Acts is modeling his speeches and his prayers after the history we see in the Old Testament. And the Hebrew Bible's historical works also narrate through a series of main characters: Moses, Joshua, various judges, Saul, David, Solomon, and various kings. Acts does the same, although primarily through Peter and Paul. Okay, my point is, the book of Acts sounds a lot like the way that the Old Testament organizes its history. If the Old Testament's history, then that probably means that the book of Acts is trying to be history. Okay, kind of a long bit of detail with that. The Hebrew Bible declares that God is in control of history, no matter how bad things may seem for his people. I think that's kind of something the Bible always reiterates it in some way, that no matter how bad things are for the people of God, God still, has got our back. God's still in control, and nothing is out of hand to where God can't fix. The same understanding is depicted in the book of Acts. For example, Acts uses such phrases as God's counsel, God's will, it is necessary, which is the phrase talking about kind of like God's divine intent, used 22 times in the book of Acts. The verb to appoint in advance or to foreordain, used 3 times. The word predestine and the word foresee. All of these words are being used here, showing that God, is in control of history. The author Luke has been influenced linguistically by the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew text. Now, I've been told some people don't know what that means. So the Old Testament, when it was originally written, was written in Hebrew, and some books or some parts of the books were written in Aramaic. Hebrew and Aramaic are sister languages, all using the same script. Okay, when it got to the point to where Alexander the Great conquered basically the known world, and introduced Hellenism, which is Greek language and culture for everybody. Everybody was speaking and reading Greek. And so the Jews at the time said, well, if everybody's reading Greek and we want them to read our Bible, which is what we would call the Old Testament, they would just call it the Hebrew Bible, we need it in a language that everyone reads. So they translated it into what is called the Septuagint. The Septuagint is just a Greek translation, a very early Greek translation of the books of the Old Testament. And they include some other books too. The point is that when we have the New Testament now, the New Testament writers, who all wrote in Greek and all spoke Greek, when they quote the Old Testament, they're going to quote out of the Septuagint 70% of the time, 7 out of 10 times. So it was kind of like that was just a common Bible that they had. Anyway, so now you do know, by the way, when something gets quoted or something gets translated, anyone who does any kind of translation knows that when you go from one to another, it's very hard to keep that sense. And there's some interesting questions how the book of Acts uses those quotations. That's a little more complicated, but we can bring that up again later. Okay. Regarding the question of genre, the fact that Acts has much in common with the Hebrew Bible's historical sections strongly suggests that Luke intended to write history. Basically, I've given you all the evidence that I can to show that Luke, when he's writing this book, and we only have one book of Acts, we have nothing else in the New Testament that's like it. It's not a gospel. It's not an epistle. It's not the book of Revelation. It's its own thing. Well, how do we know what it is? Well, every indication we have is that Luke was intending to write history from a Christian perspective. Okay, that's what we have there. Okay, I think you could have picked up the book of Acts and you could have discerned that for yourself. But we live in a day and age where there's a lot of skeptics about the Bible, and we have to give much more sophisticated answers to them to help explain what the Bible is. Telling just people, oh, you need to take it by faith is not going to convince most people anymore. We need to have better arguments. So that's what I'm doing. Let me kind of stop at this point. I've kind of been going for a while. Anyone, I know most people when they teach, they just kind of go the whole way and then they stop, but I kind of want to pause right here and catch my breath. Anyone have anything they want me to clarify on what I just said?
Yeah. Just curious, how do you know that 70%, like where do you get that number, that 70% of the New Testament writers were quoting the Septuagint?
Because you can go back and you can look at every single quotation that they use and you can compare it and see, you could just line it up with the Septuagint or line it up with the Hebrew text, and you could see which one did they quote. I mean, it just takes a lot of legwork, but that's been well documented for quite a long time, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Where
do you even? Okay. I was just like, that seems so kind of random. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mina has her hand up.
Sure. Okay. I'm not able to see the hands with my shared screen, so
okay.
I'll have you.
My question is, I didn't quite understand when you said when Luke wrote Book of Luke, mm-hmm. he wrote it in Christian bias.
Yes.
What does it mean by?
Yeah. Okay. So he's writing as a historian, but he has a Christian bias. Okay, as in he's not writing with a secular bias. Okay, he's like he's writing already believing that the Christian message is true, and he has an axe to grind because he's trying to also convince you of the Christian message. He's trying to hold up the heroes like Peter and Paul. That's what I mean by that.
Okay, I got it. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, to where if you were to read let's say you were to read an American history book on World War II, the American history book will say Germany was a bad place and Hitler was a bad person. Now, I wonder if you were to actually read a German history book. Do you think a German history book would say our own nation was absolutely terrible and the Americans were great? They probably wouldn't say that. Everyone has a bias, and we have to remember that, okay? Every single one of us has a bias. And so it's very hard for us to actually look objectively at things. And so I'm just pointing it out that it's there. But okay.
Michelle has her hand up as well.
Okay.
So when I think about, being a regular Joe, not so educated, and I just, go to the Bible and I start reading it. And in my heart, part of the reason I'm picking up the book in the first place is because I believe that it's inspired by God.
Mhm.
I believe it's God breathed. I believe that those are God's words on there, that, you know, there may be errors in transmission or, you know, whatever, but, you know, drilling down into it, when you get there, it's God's words. So some of the things that you say about, like, you know, having the historical perspective and what the writer thinks. You know, I've read the intro, the whole intro for the NET and parts of it, and that, you know, with the 65,000 translation notes and, you know, all of the people that were involved in, you know, compiling that translation, and that I started to read, you know, in that version, and somebody had made the comment, well, whatever the author was thinking, whoever the author was. And I thought, oh my gosh, you participated in this work and you don't know who the author is? And with these comments, I'm looking at some of them and I'm thinking, like, do they really, you know, is there a point where we miss that it, you know, even though it may deliver a historical perspective, I'd agree with that, even though it may have a certain perspective or a certain style or whatever, for whatever reason. I mean, gosh, he could have just picked somebody else to write it if he wanted a different writing style. I still think the writing style even, you know, is inspired by God in that regard. And so I guess I just wondered if you could comment on some of that for me.
Sure. Yeah. Good point. It gives me a good point to elaborate on this. I had a conversation with someone yesterday for like over an hour, actually, on this very subject. And I'm not exactly sure how a lot of people in their mind, when they think of inspiration, what that actually means. I think a lot of people, they think that it wouldn't really matter whom God chose to deliver the words and to put them onto paper or put them on a papyrus, because it wouldn't really matter, because God's just going to say the same thing each and every way. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. God always works with his creation, but he does it through his creation. Okay. You know, there's a reason why God wanted to give us 4 gospels from the perspective of 4 different men. Okay. He could just say, hey, let me just give you the story of Jesus and just give it one time, and it doesn't really matter. But the point is, we have 4 different human authors, and God decided to speak through them, okay? When Paul writes his letters, at the very beginning, he'll say, Paul, an apostle. Sometimes he'll even put his co-authors, Silvanus, Timothy, et cetera, et cetera. That's because having those human authors there is something that God wanted and inspired for there to be, okay? So God worked and gave us the scriptures through human authors, and he inspired them and influenced them to write down what they had. Okay. And so we need to be honest with the fact that God did use human beings to do this. Let's not bury our heads in the sand and act like that didn't happen. You know, but I don't want us to think that, you know, when Luke was writing Luke and Acts, that he just picked up his pen and God kind of put him in a trance, and Luke had no control of what's going on. And then God wrote everything down. And Luke had absolutely no say-so in the whole thing. I don't think that's exactly how it is. When we read the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, Luke tells us, he says, other people have written stories of the life of Jesus. Okay. I've looked at them, but I'm going to give it to you in a more ordered fashion. He's going to appropriately set it. So he tells us that he's writing it in his own way after reading other people, after other people have written Gospels of Jesus. Okay. We know from the end of the Gospel of John that John says, if everything that we know about Jesus was ever written, there wouldn't be enough ink in the world if all the ink was actually, you know, water in the oceans. The point is, you know, he's being selective. He knows that there's other things that could be said about Jesus, but he's being selective. There's lots of things in there. So my point is, yes, I do want to affirm inspiration, and inspiration and authority. That these texts are authoritative for our life. But when God did it by inspiring actual human people that were obedient to God's inspiration and calling to do it, and we can't act like that didn't happen, because it did happen. I mean, it's Luke wrote this, and Luke was an actual person in history. And in the book of Acts, Luke was one of the traveling companions with Paul. And so one of the reasons why we get that perspective was because Luke was there and he was an eyewitness to a lot of these things. Anyway, we could talk about that for a long time, but am I scratching where you're itching?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, if I was going to, if I wanted to provide a report on a bicycle race, I wouldn't pick a person who had never seen a bicycle race before to write the article for me. I would pick someone who was very familiar with bicycle racing, because I would feel like as I was trying to convey, the focus that I wanted them to write, that they would actually have good experience to know what kind of words to use and how much detail to provide, to convey the message that I actually wanted, in the article to report. And that I, totally can see how, that if God was going to choose a human to write a document, that he'd be very selective and make the best choice for what he wanted to convey at that time, the right level of detail and the right amount. And that makes sense.
Yeah. Without sounding disrespectful, no one could have written the thing that Luke wrote. No one else could have done that, because Luke was a traveling companion with Paul. Like Matthew couldn't have written that because Matthew wasn't there, like running around with Paul all over the Corinth and all these places. So anyway,
Dustin, let me ask you this, because we've got 3 people with hands up.
Oh boy, okay.
Do you want to address those, or do you want people to hang on and
that's okay. That's, if I don't get through all this, that's totally fine. I don't want people leaving with unanswered questions. And if they're here now, then they're important. And hopefully the questions that people are asking are creating good discussion and
okay,
stuff for other people. So
could we maybe make this a 2-parter or 3-parter?
Yeah, that's actually, Dustin, it's part of the reason why I scheduled you for Sunday as well, in case you ended up needing to do something in 2 parts. Doug and Sandy have their hand up next.
Sure, okay.
So I want to know, what do we know about who Luke was, and when did he do his writing?
I'll actually cover that a little later in this.
Okay.
We know that according to Colossians chapter 4, Luke is probably the only Gentile writer of the New Testament that we know, if it means anything to anybody. He's not an apostle, but he obviously traveled around with Paul, so we had a lot of information about that. We see that his writing is very similar to other ancient histories. When you read the Greek text of Luke, you can tell that Luke is very well educated. Some of his Greek is the most difficult in the New Testament. I think, I can't remember if it says in the New Testament he's a physician, or if that's a tradition that he's a physician. So that's probably, I don't think anybody would make that up, so it's probably true. I don't know. As far as when this was written, well, my best guess is that I do think that Luke, like the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, when he says that he has other sources in front of him, one of those is the Gospel of Mark. I do think Luke, there's evidence to show that Luke used Mark and actually added a bunch of extra things that Mark didn't have, like the genealogy, birth narratives, resurrection appearances. There's some extra parables that Luke gives, Sermon on the Plain, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be after Mark. Mark was probably written between 66 and 70. But you don't just write these things in one night. These are massive, massive documents. So I do think that when Luke was written, you could read the book of Luke and you can tell that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, anticipated the writing of the book of Acts. That actually is pretty well demonstrable. So I don't think Luke lived beyond the year 100. So my best guess is that Luke Acts were written somewhere between 70 and 100. That's probably as definitive as we can be. Other than that, I don't know. There's a lot of ifs there.
So he's called, at least in English translation, the physician in Colossians 4.
That's right. Okay, yeah, so it is there.
The underlying Greek might leave that open to some interpretation, but that's your English Bible is going to say physician.
Yeah. Okay, did I answer your question?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so next person is Gabe Hickman.
Okay. Hi, Gabe.
Hey, Dustin. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. First off, I just want to say that because you are young, everything that you're saying makes sense perfectly in my brain. So I really appreciate that. Because I'm young too. So I really appreciate your perspective on what you're teaching. And I just want to help defend some of the things that you were saying too. Firstly, like a really good point about inspiration is that because of Luke's biases and the things that he saw and his perspectives, that is why God chose him to write the book of Acts. One of the things that when you start looking at it from an analytical perspective, like what you're doing, is some people will take what you're saying and look at it the other way and say that his perspective is what made the book of Acts. Although what you're actually saying is that his perspective is the reason why God chose him as the one to divinely write the book of Acts, to write that history. So like I expected somebody to ask the question that Michelle did, and I just wanted to throw out that piece of information too. And one other thing is that I really appreciated your example about how perspective in history changes the way that history is written. One thing I will say, and you used the Hitler example, one thing I will say is I would pick another example because I've been to Germany and I've talked to people and nobody likes Hitler. So just pick a new one. But what you said is absolutely true.
Okay. I will do that.
But yeah, thank you very much, Dustin. I really love your teaching. Keep going, man. It's great.
Okay. Bad example. Hitler's never a good example. Sorry about that.
You're good.
But you didn't really use history. You used Germany.
Yeah, I have another example in mind, but next time I do this teaching, I'll modify it. So that's good feedback. Thank you.
Dean's got his hand up.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense, Dustin, on the fact that because Luke traveled with Paul, that he would understand this a lot better, and so he would be a good choice. What I don't really understand, and maybe you can make this clearer to me, is how can his bias kind of line up with God's God-breathed word in that aspect? Do you follow what I'm saying? When you're saying that he has a bias, and we all have biases, but I was always taught that obviously God worked through people, obviously.
Okay.
And people had Holy Spirit upon them or in them, and they wrote down what God told them to write. This is what I was taught, but obviously they did it in their own vocabularies. And that's why we have the different vocabularies, but it's all supposed to be God-breathed. And the God, most of or a lot of your versions will say by inspiration of God, but I believe the more literal would be God-breathed. Is there any difference between that as well? So I'm asking
let's
several questions.
We do need to talk about this, and I do think we need to think much more critically on what this means to be inspired. Okay, so let's go to this passage. Okay, we get this passage out of 2 Timothy 3:15-16. I got it up here on the text. I got the Greek text here. Usually when people quote 3:16, they don't read the previous verse. Okay, which I'm reading out of the NASB, and that from childhood you have known the grammata, the sacred writings. Okay, this is Timothy. Timothy has known the sacred writings, the scriptures, we would say, which are able to give you wisdom and lead to salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. Now, from childhood, what are these sacred writings that Timothy knew of? Those are the scriptures of the Old Testament, okay? Okay, it's not the entire New Testament, because the entire New Testament hasn't been written yet, okay? So when he talks about that, the same word, all graphy, it's talking about all scripture. But here, specifically, he's really only talking about what we would call the Old Testament. Actually, to use 2 Timothy 3:16 to say that the book of 2 Timothy is inspired is actually a circular argument. I'm not saying they aren't inspired. They are inspired, but you can't use 2 Timothy 3:16 as an argument for it. Anyway, but I want us to look very carefully. What does it mean for something to be inspired? First of all, you got this word theopneustos, okay, which is not even a word that was actually out there in the Greco-Roman world before Paul wrote this. Paul actually made this word up by putting two words together. The word theos, the word for God, and the word pneuma, which could be spirit, wind, or breath, okay? Which is why some translations will say God breathed, inspired by God. You know, it's legitimate to even say it's blown over by God's wind, okay? It could mean a variety of things, okay? But I want to know, what does it do? What does it mean for something to be inspired, okay? It's profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, training in righteousness. Moving along. Why? What's the purpose? Ina means in order that. Okay, so what's the entire what is the reason for us to have inspired scriptures? So that the man of God, I'm going to say the person of God, may be adequate and equipped for every good work. Okay? The purpose of scriptures being inspired is for their usefulness to equip us for good works. Okay? I think a lot of people think that inspiration means something more than that, but that's not actually what the verse says. Okay? So just because something is inspired doesn't mean it's completely objective. Obviously, God's got a perspective. God's not going to tell us all the merits of the devil or of these pagan gods. God's going to give us his message, and he only wants us to hear his message. He only wants us to worship him as God. He doesn't want us to go and to try out all these other gods and all these other religions and all these other lords. God is very exclusive with his message. Maybe you guys think that the word bias is a negative word. It's not a negative word. It's just a neutral word meaning your own perspective. But your own perspective, I wouldn't say that the perspective that each of you individuals have is negative in any way. That's your perspective. That's who you are. That's what makes you who you are. You probably think that's very important to who you are. You would probably say it's a positive thing about you. I didn't mean to make a big issue about saying Luke has a bias. I think it's just clear. Luke is writing as a Christian historian. He's not writing as a secular historian. He's not writing as a non-Christian historian. He's writing with an axe to grind, trying to convince people of the Christian message. That's what I mean by him having a bias. And God inspired him to have that message because God also wants people to accept the Christian message.
Okay, but he obviously God wanted him to say what he wanted said. Is that correct?
I think so. Yes. I think what we have in the Bible is what God wanted us to have.
So that's where we can place our trust. It's not something that is, well, it might be true here and it might not be true there.
Yeah. What have I said that gives you the indication that we shouldn't trust the Book of Acts? Because that's not. I did not mean to say that. And if I've said that, okay, I need to correct that.
I guess the word bias and the fact that understanding the way you were putting it kind of threw me on that. Because people can have biases that are totally off kilter, and here we're talking about God's word. We're not talking about somebody's opinion per se.
Okay, I'm gonna. Well, it is his opinion, but his opinion is truthful.
Well, that's what I'm saying. His opinion has to be truthful, otherwise it couldn't be inspired by God per se.
Yeah, maybe I'll substitute the word perspective for bias. If I use the word perspective, is that less offensive to people?
That makes more sense, because bias really in our culture seems to have, to me, a negative connotation.
All I'm saying is that Luke is deliberately and openly and unapologetically writing from a Christian perspective, That's what I'm trying to say. And he doesn't hide the fact that he is writing history, focusing specifically on Christian events. Okay.
What especially made sense is the fact that he traveled with Paul, so he was the most appropriate one. Plus, he was very intelligent to write the book of Acts.
Okay. Sorry if I've said all that in a way that was confusing to people. That was never my intent.
Mina has her hand up.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the problem with the bias, using the word bias, is because nowadays it's used as a negative thing. But as I heard your explanation, I can see it's a clear. I don't see anything wrong with it in order to get a right bias, but I think, and also on the other extreme, like God breathed, and then people have tendency to a lot of religiosity circles thinking like God just totally possess you and then write it down or things like that. And so I think there's a balance. I think you're making very good balance of, number one, the Luke was a Christian bias is because he has Holy Spirit. He's got Spirit of God. And Christians, we are biased, interested in God because we have a Spirit of God. So, once you explain, once you understand what's going on, then bias doesn't mean always negative. But I think the problem here today is a lot of people use that word in negative terms.
Yeah, I didn't mean that. I apologize. All I just mean as a perspective. Luke has a Christian perspective.
I perfectly understood what you're saying, though. No, that was good explanation.
I am very biased towards Jesus Christ.
Me too.
And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't like. There's nothing like. We all need to admit that we have a bias. That's okay. There's nothing negative about us. It means we have our own opinion. Okay, and it's fine.
I think according to the scriptures, one day everyone will be biased towards Jesus Christ.
I'd say all the righteous would be.
Yes. Well, they'll be the only ones left around. All right. Yeah. Let's see. We had John Sant has his hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, and you probably didn't see it. It might be helpful for you to use that Luke had a Christian, Christ-centered worldview. That was his bias.
All right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go up here and I'm going to correct it in this thing. My goodness, one little word, and my whole teaching gets train wrecked.
Dustin,
I put Christian bias.
I'm losing my mind over here because I understand everything that you said the first time around, and I don't mean to criticize anybody, but let's not bone pick, okay? Let Dustin share what he shares and try to move your brains and your heart to understand what the man is saying. Forgive me, but I think we're getting a little bit tedious here.
All right, I put in the word perspective. I got rid of the word bias. Boom! I hit save. All right, we're good to go. Okay.
I think that was Donna's bias.
Okay. No. I slipped Donna a $20 bill for her to be my friend. So.
All right. So let's get back on track, like Donna said. And we don't have any more hands raised. So quick, go.
Okay. All right.
Point of view also works.
Point of view. There you go. We're good. Okay. Goodness gracious. All right. Where are we? Okay. Purpose of Acts. Okay. We do need to talk about this. I'm going to move my bubble back up here. All right. Several hints can be gathered together to suggest Luke's purpose for writing Acts. Number one, the motif of fulfillment. The word fulfill, which is the Greek verb pleroo, appears 16 times in Acts. Also appears 8 times in Luke's gospel. Luke's use of this word in Acts actually rivals Matthew's use of it, who also uses it 16 times. You're probably, by the way, familiar that Matthew, when he wants to use a quotation of the Old Testament for Jesus, he'll say, and this was done in order to fulfill this passage written in the Old Testament of Jesus. Okay, so we know Matthew's got a major theme. It's interesting that the book of Acts uses it just as many times. And actually, if you count the Gospel of Luke, you get more times. So they both tie for the most usages in the New Testament. Other words of lesser frequency are used in Acts to additionally indicate the motif of fulfillment. Okay, so the book of Acts is trying to show us that something is being fulfilled in this document. That's a major theme. Okay, when a word keeps showing up, that's probably a good reason for it. All right. Number 2, Acts chapter 1 and verse 8 is a prediction of sorts of God's plan to be carried out through the apostles. Now we're going to back out here so we can look at Acts 1:8. Okay. Acts 1:8 says in NASB, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and even to the remotest part of the earth." Okay. Back to my show here. Okay. So the book of Acts demonstrates, by the way, how this plan came to pass. Because remember, in Acts 1:8, Jesus said that you're going to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. So notice then the book of Acts, so Acts chapter 1 is Jesus commissions them. In Acts chapters 2 through 7, as you can see here, it's concentrated in Jerusalem, and then it goes to Judea and Samaria in chapters 8 through 11, and then to the ends of the earth through 12 to 28. So the structure of Acts is based around the motif of fulfillment of Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. Okay, not all verses are created equally. I do think Acts 1:8 actually is the purpose statement of the entire book. I'm laying my cards on the table, and I'm trying to demonstrate that even Luke has arranged his book to show fulfillment of Jesus' promise there. Number 3, the Old Testament is cited often with the function of demonstrating its ultimate expression in the life of Jesus and his followers. I'll give you an example. In Joel chapter 2, it says that in the last days, God's going to pour out his Spirit on all mankind. It gets quoted in Acts chapter 2 and say, this is actually happening right now on the day of Pentecost. So from the perspective of Luke, I hope this isn't really offensive to people, but the last days began when the church started. That's when the last days have started. And he's saying, hey, the prophecies of Joel 2 are being realized now in Acts chapter 2. So it's just kind of interesting that they cite passages from the Old Testament to demonstrate fulfillment in the lives and activities expressed in the book of Acts. Point number 4. The ironic use of the Hebrew Bible, considered a Jewish document, actually argues for the inclusion of the Gentiles into the people of God. What that means is that the book of Acts uses a Jewish book to make the argument that the Gentiles need to be included with the Jews. So there's some sort of irony there, but that involves some fulfillment. Number 5, on the same line of thinking in regard to the Gentiles and Jews, the earliest readers of Acts were likely living in a time when the church was primarily composed of Gentiles in the late first century, with very few believing Jews remaining. It was a considerable sacrifice and a commitment for a pagan, as a pagan Gentile, to fully convert to Christianity. Yet it seemed like the God of Christianity has abandoned his chosen people, the Jews. By the end of the first century, you probably could look around, you look in the church and you say, where are all these Jews? Might this God also potentially abandon the Gentiles? One might ask. Luke seems to write Acts with a view to comfort and encourage Gentile converts of God's faithfulness. Luke also attempts to depict the reason for the decreasing number of Jewish believers in Jesus. What you'll notice is that in the book of Acts, the Jews that don't believe do it because they fail to understand the message, they're hard-hearted, or they don't have faith. Okay, so the book of Acts is also written in a way to comfort the people of its time, to say, hey, God's not going to abandon you. God hasn't abandoned the Jews. The reason why the Jews aren't here is because of their own unbelief. So just another purpose of Acts. Number 6, the emphases in Acts show the intention of Luke. Okay, we notice this: Christians in Acts, they are law-abiding citizens who will not threaten the political stability of the Roman Empire. Paul is regularly portrayed as a good Roman citizen, able to secure good Roman treatment at the hand of a variety of Roman magistrates. Okay, I don't know if you guys have thought about this. You know that Paul wrote letters in prison? Everybody know that? Everyone know that Paul wrote letters from prison? They're called prison epistles. And let me ask you, if you heard that a Christian was in prison, like today, you most likely would think, oh, what did they do wrong? And Paul was in prison somewhere between 5 to 7 years of his life. Now, what did he do to get in prison? Okay? So, something happened to where Paul got put into prison, okay? I mean, some people thought he was breaking the law, but the book of Acts depicts Paul as a good, law-abiding citizen, okay? Because Acts wants to demonstrate that Christians are not troublemakers. They're not a bunch of lawbreakers, okay? When sedition is brought up, Acts is careful to draw a distinction between the apostles and the guilty individuals. And I put some passages there to where when there are problems that are arising within the Roman Empire, the Christians are innocent, and there's a distinct group of guilty individuals, and the Christians are never actually guilty. Okay? Disorderly behavior comes from the opponents of Christianity, not from the apostles. And this seems to indicate that Luke wishes to defend Christianity against the charge of being deliberately seditious and hostile to Rome. Now, we should carefully note that this does not mean that the Christian message was not counter-imperial. And I'm going to go back and look at a passage here in 17:7. Both Jesus and Paul clearly and regularly regard Rome as an evil from which believers should distance themselves. Okay, I want to read that passage in Acts chapter 17 and verse 7. Very, very powerful verse, and I don't think people realize what this is doing. So Jason had welcomed them. This is Jason. He's got this is in Thessalonica. They have a house church there. And they were saying, this is what people are saying, Christians, they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. Okay? So this is what they were saying when they were going and preaching the gospel. And they were telling people about the gospel of Jesus Christ, that Jesus died and rose for them, and that he's the coming king of the new kingdom and the new empire. They're basically saying Caesar's not really the true king, and the Roman Empire is not really the real empire that's going to last. So the Christian gospel is actually implicitly seditious against the Roman Empire. And that probably explains a little bit as to why Paul was thrown in jail so many times. I can give a whole 2-hour lecture on the anti-imperial comments in theology in the New Testament. We don't have time for that now. Let's probably do, let's do one more, and we'll see how many more questions are brought up. I haven't seen the word bias yet, so hopefully no one else has stormed off. Okay, purpose of Acts continued. Number 7. In the ancient world, the legitimacy of a religious movement, let me move my cursor here, religious movement was tied to its heritage and the length of time since its conception. Basically, how legitimate a religious movement was based on how long it's been there. Judaism could be appreciated by Rome since they could recall David, a famous king from 1,000 years ago. Obviously, we know that the religion of Israel and the Israelites goes back much farther, but they would relate it to tangible things like a kingdom and a king. Judaism even outshined Rome in this regard, who could only trace their history back 700 years to the founding figures of Romulus and Remus. Luke strategically argues the early Christian movement is an extension of the established Judaic religion. Okay, so he's saying it might look like Christianity is a brand new thing, but it's not, because it's the fulfillment of Israel. It's a fulfillment of Judaism, and therefore it goes back just as far as Judaism goes. Therefore, it's legitimate. That's the argument. I wrote this as likely in a polemical apologetic against critics, accusing it of being new and therefore illegitimate as a religion. Not surprising, the same polemical arguments are found in Romans, of all books, the first 5 verses. That's just kind of more for your notes. First 5 verses of Romans, Paul has 5 different things that he says about the Christian gospel that actually make Christianity look good and makes the Roman Empire look bad if you read it the correct way. So that's just because something like in our culture, we kind of keep religion and politics separated. In their culture, you couldn't separate them. Everything that was religious was also political. To say that Jesus is the Messiah is both a religious and a political statement. Saying that Caesar is Lord is a religious and a political statement. Okay, Jesus is a religious and a political figure. The kingdom of God is a religious and a political entity. So that's another different part of their culture compared to ours. The rhetoric of Luke's speeches, which are intended to the in the ancient world to persuade behavior. I can't emphasize that the most. The reason why people would write speeches down and to give speeches were not just to just blow a bunch of warm air and just to say what's on their mind. The purpose specifically was to persuade behavior. So speeches in the book of Acts, which anybody remembers how much of the book of Acts is speeches? Who wants extra credit? How much of the book of Acts is speeches? 1/3. Very good. There you go. Yeah. A little over 9 chapters. 1/3 of the book of Acts is speeches. Okay. If the purpose of speeches is to persuade behavior, then this leads modern readers to 1, demonstrate obedience to God. 2, respond positively to God's leading. 3, eagerly seize any opportunity to preach the gospel that presents itself. And 4, willingly endure oppression, violence, imprisonment, and even death. Who wants to sign up for this Christian movement? I don't know. That's the purpose of the speeches. The speeches are not just to give us theology, they're to get us to change our behavior. All right, these are probably the last 2 things that I'll say, and then we'll open it up for questions again. Okay, so what the book of Acts is, okay, because I'm going to tell you what it is and what it is not. All right, so what it is, okay. Acts is limited to a period of 30 years, from around the year 30 to 60, okay. It's limited in geographical scope. It doesn't say anything about Christianity in Egypt or in Africa or in Spain or in Britain. We know that there are Christian communities in Spain and Britain in the 1st century. We know that eventually, like in Acts chapter 8, who was the guy? Philip converts this Ethiopian eunuch. We don't know anything about Christianity in Ethiopia, which is basically down there in Africa. So it's very limited. Acts only tells us about a few places. It's specific in theme. We saw in Acts chapter 1:8 being the progress of the Christian mission from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And by the way, when they mean the ends of the earth, they mean Rome. That's the ends of the earth for them. It tends to focus on one figure at a time, mostly on Peter and Paul. Notice this. Very little to nothing is mentioned regarding the ministries of most of the other apostles. What about Matthew? What about the Acts of Matthew? What happens to him? What about Bartholomew? No one ever tells us anything about Bartholomew. They get left out, okay? Most of the apostles get left out, all right? It's intentional and it's apologetic, another word for defense, of Christianity, and particularly of Paul's behavior, okay? So it's trying to defend Christianity and to make Paul out to not be a troublemaker. Depending on your perspective, whether Paul's a troublemaker or not, that kind of just depends on your perspective. And so what I think Acts is, if you were to push me in their corner and say, what is the book of Acts? Okay, what is the one thing I want you to get out of here? If there's anything that I want you to learn today, this is it. Acts is a selective, organized, and apologetic historical account of how the gospel message got to Rome, beginning from Jerusalem. That's what the book of Acts is. Okay? Now, by saying that what it is, you got to look at the other side of the coin. What Acts is not? The Acts is not the history of the early church. It's very selective. It doesn't tell us all the history. It only tells us some of the history. So you can't call it the history, okay? It's not the Acts of the apostles because most of the apostles are not discussed at all. I mean, you could just see that, okay? It's Peter and then Paul and most of the other guys, 80% of them, just you don't know anything about them. It's not a word-for-word account of the apostles' preaching. The speeches are summaries from Luke's perspective. Okay? It's not an unbiased record. Oh, I used that word again. Okay. All right. Luke often avoids controversial topics which certainly arose. Okay? Here's something that I want you to know. Paul went around and he was taking up a collection. You can see this in 1 Corinthians 16. You can see this in Galatians. He talks about this. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. Romans 15 also talks about it. So we know Paul's going around making a collection from the Gentiles to give to the Jerusalem church. In Acts chapter 24, 25, when he gets there, nothing is mentioned of this collection at all. Okay? We also know from Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 16, that there was a dispute, a big fight between Peter and Paul. Not even mention the book of Acts at all. Luke tends to not talk about controversial topics when they arose. We know they arose. Okay, so the point is, Luke is he is what's the word? I don't want to say unbiased. It is from Luke's perspective. Okay, how about this? It's not objective. It's not an objective record. It's very subjective. Okay, that's the word I'm going to use. And it's not intended to be a model. The key word there is model for church structure and practices, because much of what is depicted cannot be easily reproduced. There's an episode in Acts 19 where they rebaptized in water those people who were baptized by John the Baptist. Okay, you can't reproduce that today, because you can't name a person that you're going to meet today that was baptized by John the Baptist. I remember I asked this in class, and I said, name one person who is still alive today who was baptized by John the Baptist. And a very keen student said, Jesus. And I was like, you're good. Okay. You see that? Like, you can't just take every single, all the practices in the book of Acts and say, that's meant to be an absolute model. That's not what the purpose of the book of Acts is. It's not meant to be a model. It's meant to be a selective history. Okay. I've got a whole bunch of other slides, but I think I've kind of put enough on the table for us to get going. Are there hands raised? Are there any other questions?
Just about that selective history model. What I'm always been a great place to, for instance, smaller home churches seem to be or preferred over a larger one. Hey, that church, but now is that wrong?
You were cutting in and out a little bit, but I think the gist of what you said was that a lot of the smaller home churches, home fellowships, try to do something similar to the book of Acts. I don't think it's wrong. I just think that Luke never intended his history to be used as the blueprint for how you are to build your church. I don't think that was the purpose of it. Okay? Because in Acts chapter 2, when they all gathered together, everyone had flames of fire on top of their heads. And I don't know about you, but I don't see that every single time we have fellowship. Like I said, there's just some things in the book of Acts that they can't be reproduced. And if they can't be reproduced, then it wasn't intended to be an exact model. Obviously, there are a lot of things in there that Christians still do. But its purpose, because I'm saying what Acts is not. Acts is a history, a selective history. What it's not meant to be the blueprint for how we're to run and operate our churches. The best way to learn how to run and operate our churches is probably reading the letters of Paul. And we have more than enough information on that. Did that answer your question, Sarah?
It did, but I'm not sure that I agree, and that's okay.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'm probably wrong. So.
Does anybody else have questions? It's actually probably a pretty good stopping point. I thought it'd be. Michelle's got her hand up, so let's let Michelle talk, and then we'll stop there and we'll do some prayer.
Sure. Okay.
Go ahead, Michelle.
It wasn't really a question. It seemed like you were reaching for a word as far as Paul avoiding controversial things. And the word that came to mind from you was like diplomatic. Like, sometimes you'll have a mom in a family where, two brothers are fighting over something and the mom steps in as the diplomat. She doesn't want to see anyone in the family fighting, just soften it up. This is your brother, work together, be friends.
Yeah, that, the thing with the collection, and I want people to think about this a little bit. Paul was gathering that collection for multiple years. And reason was because Paul believed that his gospel was for Jews and Gentiles together. And therefore, Jews and Gentiles should work together and to take care of each other. So Gentiles should share in their material blessings with their brothers and sisters in Christ, the Jews. But here's the thing. In the book of Acts, if the Jerusalem church had accepted that collection, certainly Luke would have talked about it. They would have said, they rejoiced and they celebrated and everything was great and everyone was super happy and the Jerusalem church was filled and it was good. But nothing is said about it at all. And to me, that makes me and a lot of other scholars think that it wasn't accepted. And there's good historical reasons why that might take place. Because if you're a very conservative Jew, you don't know where the Gentile Christians got their money. Did they get it from pagan practices? Did they get it from idols, or from gambling, or from any of that kind of stuff? There's like think of it today. If I went to the horse races and I won $2 million and I said I want to donate it to the church, there's going to be some people in the church that are going to say, hallelujah, we'll take that $2 million. And there's some other people in the church that are going to say, no, that money is tainted and I don't want to have anything to do with it. So the fact that the book of Acts didn't celebrate this when they should have tells me that it's very likely they didn't accept it, despite the fact that the book of Acts mentions the collection. So he's aware that it happened, but it's not there. Now, if that's the case, if that money wasn't there, that actually gives us a good historical explanation as to how Paul had the money and the funds while he was in prison, whether in Caesarea Philippi in Acts chapter 26 or in Rome in Acts chapter 28, to write his prison epistles. Okay, you got to have money and documents upon which to write those things, because that stuff is not cheap. So where did he get that money? Well, because he's got a big pile in his pocket. Anyway, so that's more of like a, next time you're on Jeopardy, you'll have the answer to that question, sort of trivia. But
all right, well, let's I'm gonna stop the recording. Hang on.